Donc cette session est co-managée par moi-même, je m'appelle Marc Auriacombe, je viens de l'Université de Bordeaux, et par Nicolas Autier qui vient de l'Université de Clermont-Ferrand. Et on va faire comme pour la session précédente, les deux orateurs vont intervenir. Ils ont un thème commun, l'innovation, mais vous verrez qu'ils ont un contenu très différent, puisque l'un est psychiatre addictologue et l'autre est chirurgien hépatologue. Donc, sans plus attendre, j'appelle Kyle KAMPMAN. Kyle KAMPMAN est psychiatre addictologue, professeur à l'Université de Pennsylvanie à Philadelphie, où il est arrivé à la fin des années 90. Il a travaillé dans l'équipe de Chuck O'Brien, que tout le monde connaît à l'ALBATROS. C'est un de ses élèves. Il a particulièrement travaillé c'est un clinicien, c'est aussi un chercheur sur la cocaïne et d'autres éléments, mais aussi sur la crise des opiacés aux États-Unis actuellement. Et pour ceux d'entre vous qui publient, c'est un des éditeurs de la revue Drogue et Alcool Dépendance, qui est une des 2-3 revues majeures dans le champ de l'addictologie. Kyle.
Thank you very much. And I'd like to thank Dr. Benhameen for inviting me here today. It's my first time here, and I'm having a wonderful time. So today I'm going to talk about the problem of opioid use disorder. And it's a problem that's been evolving for the last few years in North America, with a transition from prescription opiates to heroin and now to fentanyl. And with the widespread use of fentanyl, we're currently experiencing a great number of opioid overdose deaths, and we're concerned that the presence of fentanyl will make it difficult for our current medications to continue to be effective. But as the problem has evolved, so too have our treatments evolved. And in addition to talking about the challenge of fentanyl, I'd like to talk about some of the medications that are either just released or about to be released that offer great promise for the treatment of opioid use disorder. So, all right, these are my disclosures. And here's what we're going to do. In the next 40 minutes, I'm going to talk about 3 things. First, I'm going to discuss the current state of opioid use disorder, primarily in North America. Talk about the contribution of fentanyl to this problem of opioid use disorder that we experience now and y'all may experience soon. And then finally discuss some of the advances in the pharmacologic treatment of opiate use disorder. All right, so here's how we started. Our current problem with opioid use disorder started with the abuse of prescription opiates. In the 1990s, there was an emphasis on the aggressive treatment of pain with opioid pain medications. This dramatically increased the availability of these medications and led to the widespread non-medical use or abuse of prescription opioids. What you see on the slide is data from the National Survey on Drug Use and Health, showing that over 3 million Americans used a opioid for non-medical reasons in the past month. And of course, the abuse of prescription opioids is the most common of the abuse of any of the prescription medications. So this is where it started. And unfortunately, this is not where it ended. It has evolved. And the first thing that we noticed is that we have a prescription opioid problem leading to the use of heroin problem. And this was shown quite nicely in an article in JAMA Psychiatry in 2014. And what's shown here is a graph showing that the percent of heroin users followed from 1960 up to 2010 who began their opiate use with heroin versus beginning with a prescription opiate. And you can see in 1960, the vast majority of heroin users started with heroin and continued to use it. But if you advance up to the year 2000, you can see that this reversed. And more than 70% of heroin users began with prescription opioids and then moved to heroin. And this is what I see in my patients. My young people would prefer to use oxycodone. They prefer to use it intranasally. It's their drug of choice. But if the oxycodone gets hard to find, or if they run low on money, they will turn to heroin, and they can use the heroin in Philadelphia the same way they use oxycodone, intranasally. And they'll generally go back and forth between oxycodone unless they switch their route of administration. And many who switch to IV heroin will never go back to intranasal use of any drug and will be then have the problems that IV drug users have. So that is a problem. Now, as physicians in the United States have tried to control the availability of prescription opioids by reducing our prescriptions, what's occurred is that now we're finding that heroin, as the first opioid of regular use, is becoming more common. And this is a graph with data from 6,000 entrants into inpatient addiction treatment facilities from 2010 to 2016. And that what they were asked was, what was the first opiate that you used regularly to get high? In order to avoid recall bias or survival bias, data is only shown from 2005 to 2015. Now you can see here, in 2005, heroin was first drug regularly used in only 9% of patients. That's consistent with what we saw on the last slide. But go forward in time from 2005 to 2015, and you can see now heroin is the first drug of regular use 33% of the time. And in fact, in 2015, is the most common drug or opiate first used regularly. And oxycodone, hydrocodone, the ones that I'm used to seeing in my young people, has declined in becoming the drug that they first use regularly. So again, we've progressed from a largely prescription opiate problem to a heroin problem, and then on to the next problem. So one of the most devastating parts of this whole opiate epidemic is the increase in opiate overdose deaths that we've seen. And despite the fact that physicians are now prescribing much less prescription opiates and we've got less prescription opiate abuse out there, we're still seeing a dramatic increase in the number of opiate overdose deaths. And part of this is due to the availability and the use of fentanyl. This slide comes from data from this CDC. It was a special study where they looked at the prescription overdose deaths in the 10 states in the United States that had the highest number of opioid overdose deaths. And they looked at this in 2016 from July to December, and what they found was that the drug that was most commonly found in people who died of opiate overdose was fentanyl. In fact, during this time period, over 50% of the people who died from opiate overdose had fentanyl in their system. Philadelphia, my home, it has a particular problem with fentanyl. And in 2016, the medical examiner reported that over 70% of opiate users who died from overdose had fentanyl in their system at the time of death. So fentanyl is killing drug users. Now, my understanding is that in France, you don't yet have a prescription opiate problem like we do in the United States, and you don't yet have a fentanyl problem like we do in the United States. But what I'm concerned about is that this problem with fentanyl is going to grow and threaten other parts in the world, despite in addition to North America. Okay, so fentanyl. What is fentanyl? Here's some basics about fentanyl. It's a synthetic opioid pain reliever, first developed to be rapid onset and short acting. And it does that by being highly lipophilic, which again increases the speed of onset and reduces the total time of effect. It is very high potent. It's about 100 times more potent than morphine, which is probably what makes it so dangerous in use. It has a relatively short half-life of about 7 hours. Its receptor affinity is equivalent to morphine. It doesn't have any higher affinity for the opiate receptor than other full agonists, and it has a number of chemical analogs that go with fentanyl. There are a number of derivatives. There is sufentanil and remifentanil, arfentanil, and carfentanil. These are drugs available for human use as well as veterinary use. The one that's particularly dangerous is carfentanil, which is a large animal tranquilizer that has potency at the opiate receptor an order of magnitude above fentanyl, making it an incredibly dangerous drug. So the history of fentanyl as a drug of abuse is interesting. Fentanyl was first developed in 1960 by Paul Janssen at Janssen Pharmaceuticals, and what he was trying to develop was an intraoperative analgesic, potentially anesthetic, that would have a very rapid onset of effect and be very high potent. And it was developed as an intraoperative analgesic and anesthetic and available in 1970s in a medicine called Sublimase. Now later, and it was always conceived of as an intravenous drug because it had poor oral bioavailability. But later, in the 1990s, they developed ways of giving fentanyl that didn't involve oral use. So for instance, it was put into patches for transdermal use in a product called Duragesic, intended for the treatment of cancer and later other chronic pain problems. It was also put into a lozenge on a stick called Oralet, which was used as a pre-anesthetic medication. It came out as a sublingual spray and a nasal spray. So it was available a lot for the treatment of pain in the 1990s. And its abuse began really in the 1980s, before it was used for pain. So it was mainly used intraoperatively. So the first people that abused fentanyl were clinicians. And then later, as it became a medication more available for the treatment of pain, other people began to abuse it. Now, an ironic fact is that the two epidemics of fentanyl use that we've experienced in the United States have both been associated not with prescription fentanyl, but with illicit fentanyl developed in clandestine laboratories. In 2006, we had a very short-lived problem with fentanyl that was traced back to a single lab in Mexico. And once that laboratory was closed, our problem ended. And we'll talk more about where the current source of fentanyl is for our current epidemic. All right, so what makes fentanyl dangerous? Well, the high potency of fentanyl and fentanyl analogs put heroin users at risk. And as an example, what you see there presented on this slide is a lethal dose of heroin compared to a lethal dose of fentanyl. So if you're mixing your fentanyl in with heroin, as drug dealers do in the United States, you have to be careful about this whole idea of potency and understand the difference between micrograms and milligrams. And many drug dealers do not, and that is one of the problems that we're having with overdoses of fentanyl. Now, the second thing that makes fentanyl dangerous is that currently there is a manufacturing going on of counterfeit pills that may expose individuals with little or no tolerance or opiate tolerance to fentanyl. So what you see on this slide on the left is a real Xanax alprazolam tablet compared to a fake Xanax tablet which contains fentanyl. And on the right, you see a real combination acetaminophen and hydrocodone tablet, Vicodin, and a fake Vicodin tablet containing fentanyl. They're very convincing, and the machinery used to make these is pretty good. So what's really dangerous about this is that these fake pills contain somewhere between 1 and 1.5 milligrams of fentanyl per pill. And for an opioid-naive individual, 2 milligrams of fentanyl is potentially a lethal dose. So that's what's making fentanyl so dangerous. It's a very high potency, and patients just aren't really aware often that they're being exposed to fentanyl. So where does fentanyl come from? Fentanyl, primarily coming to North America, originates in China and is imported either as fentanyl or as the precursors and then made into fentanyl in laboratories over here in North America, rather. And the arrows don't represent actual routes. It's just sort of an illustration that this stuff is coming from China to North America and going between Canada, Mexico, and the United States. And that's where the fentanyl is coming from that's being used right now. So, fentanyl exposure in North America. Are we finding all this fentanyl in opioid overdoses because it's generally being used or because it is selectively found in fatal overdoses? Well, fentanyl exposure in the United States is a mixed bag. It is very uneven. Fentanyl in heroin is much more common in places where white powder heroin is available, which is the east coast of the United States. In Philadelphia, that's what we use. On the other hand, on the west coast of the United States, there's black tar heroin is used very commonly. So you see less of a fentanyl problem in the heroin on the west coast as you do in the east coast. And there are locations where the exposure to fentanyl is very high. One of these happens to be New England. And what's shown here is data from a study in Fall River, Massachusetts, where they looked at urine samples from 231 opioid users admitted for detoxification in Falls River. And what they found was 87% of the patients admitted to detox had fentanyl in their urine. Of those reporting no fentanyl exposure, 2/3 had fentanyl in their urine. So these are people that did not know that they were taking fentanyl, but yet 2/3 of them had fentanyl in their urine drug screens. As you might imagine, heroin users are much more likely to be positive for fentanyl compared to non-heroin users. Now, other states in the United States support significant fentanyl exposure, and there's another place where it's really bad, and that is in British Columbia. And this is data taken from a study in British Columbia where they identified a little bit over 100 of drug users who were attending harm reduction clinics in the area of British Columbia. And they simply asked them what drugs they had used in the past 3 days and took a urine sample and tested it for fentanyl. And what they discovered was overall 29% of the urine samples tested positive for fentanyl. And of those that tested positive for fentanyl, 73% came from people who reported no fentanyl use in the past 3 days. So again, these are people who are exposed to fentanyl who have no idea that they're receiving it. And what you see on the graph, on the x-axis, you see all the different drugs that reported use, and the line that goes across the dashed line shows the percent of samples that were fentanyl positive. So we're looking at about 30%, 40% positive for crystal meth users, crack users about 30% positive, powder cocaine 30% positive. Again, exposure to fentanyl when you may not expect it, you may not have tolerance, is going to lead to a problem with overdose. So does fentanyl affect treatment response? Really very little is known about that. What we do know is that there are multiple case reports that suggest that higher doses of naloxone are needed in the case of treating fentanyl overdose. And the data was so compelling that at an FDA meeting, the FDA decided to update its recommendation of how much naloxone is needed to reverse an opiate overdose from 0.4 milligrams IM up to 2 milligrams of IM. So we know you need more naloxone to overcome fentanyl overdose. What about methadone? What about buprenorphine? What about Vivitrol? What do we know about that? Absolutely nothing. We have no idea whether or not fentanyl is more difficult to treat. We suspect it is. We suspect it may be much harder to block the high from fentanyl compared to morphine and other opiates, but we really don't know. There's nothing in the literature that suggests that. All right, so I was hoping when this whole fentanyl thing began that it would be over quickly like it was in 2006, but it doesn't look like that's going to happen. And one of the reasons for that is because fentanyl is incredibly profitable. So what is shown here is from a DEA report, and what it shows is the potential revenue generated from fentanyl pill sales using 1 kilogram of fentanyl. So you can put 1 milligram in your pills, you can put 1.5 milligrams in your pills, you can price your pills from $10 up to $20, and what you're gonna get for 1 kilogram of fentanyl is between $6 and $20 million in profit. So how much does 1 kilogram of fentanyl cost? Well, in this DEA report, they reported that 1 kilogram was purchased for as little as $1,700, and there was another kilogram that was purchased for about $3,400. So it's very, very profitable, and it's easy to make, and it is easy to import and smuggle, and it looks like this could be a problem for a long time to come. All right, so that's all I have to say about fentanyl. What I want to focus on now are the new treatments that we have for opioid use disorder, and I'm going to focus on buprenorphine products, 3 in particular. I'm going to talk about probufene, which is an implantable form of buprenorphine. I'm going to talk about CAM-2038, which is an injectable buprenorphine, and I'm going to talk about Blockade, which is another injectable buprenorphine product. So before I do that, I want to make sure that we're all on the same page and understand that medication-assisted treatment is by far the most efficacious treatment for the treatment of opioid use disorder. And we know this because we know that detoxification and referral to counseling without a relapse prevention medication is going to lead to relapse in the vast majority of times. And this doesn't matter if you do it inpatient or you do it outpatient. People referred to counseling alone are going to relapse. We also know that detoxification and counseling alone may be dangerous by exposing people to the chance of overdose and death because of the loss of tolerance, which happens a lot more quickly than people realize. And that based on this, we need to use relapse prevention medications, and we need to treat opioid addiction as a long-term illness, not just for a few weeks or a few days. All right, so we're going to talk about buprenorphine. Just to review, buprenorphine is a partial agonist at the mu-opiate receptor. It is an antagonist at the kappa-opiate receptor. It has a higher affinity for that mu-opiate receptor than any full agonist, very long-acting, available for opiate dependence since 2002, comes in multiple formulations: Subutex, which is buprenorphine monoproduct, which is used more commonly here in Europe; Suboxone, which is the combination buprenorphine naloxone used more commonly in the United States; Zubsolv, which is a rapidly dissolving sublingual tablet; and Bunavail, which is buccal film. So this is what we have with buprenorphine. And what I've taught all my medical students for the last 10, 15 years is that the ideal medication for the treatment of opioid use disorder does three things. It stops withdrawal symptoms. I want my patient using heroin on Monday and using my medication on Tuesday and not feeling sick. That's important. I also want this medication to reduce craving, to take away that overwhelming desire to use drugs that is the most common cause of relapse. And if you have a medicine that reduces craving, patients will want to take it, and your adherence is going to be much better. So reducing craving is important. And then finally, we want a medication that's going to block the high from abused opiates. So buprenorphine, certainly not the ideal medicine, but has many aspects of the ideal medication. It has enough opiate agonist effect to take away withdrawal and reduce craving, and it has a higher affinity for the mu-opiate receptor than any full agonist. So it is very effective at blocking the high. So it's a good medication. We know it works based on a number of trials. This is just simply an example of one of the early trials comparing buprenorphine to high-dose methadone and low-dose methadone. And in trials that are relatively short duration with fixed doses, buprenorphine is about as effective as high-dose methadone for the treatment of opioid use disorder. So buprenorphine works. It's an effective medication. It's widely used. But you know, buprenorphine isn't without problems. And one of the big problems with buprenorphine is a problem in adherence. In some studies, you'll see that adequate adherence has been shown to be achieved in less than 50% of patients. So for instance, in a trial involving African American subjects in the United States with opioid use disorder who were participating in office-based buprenorphine treatment, only 48% of the subjects were adherent with the medication, as defined as having 80% or more of their visits associated with a positive urine drug screen for buprenorphine. It takes a long time not using your buprenorphine to have your urine go down to zero. That's not something like you skipped a day. So that's problematic. Another example was an examination of medical and pharmacy claims data over a year. It showed only 32% of patients participating in office-based buprenorphine treatment took their buprenorphine on 80% more of days. So again, adherence is a problem with buprenorphine. The other side of that adherence problem is what happens to the medications that aren't taken? Well, often the medications that aren't taken by patients are diverted. And this is data from a paper published back in 2012. And what they did was they asked patients being admitted to an inpatient detoxification what drugs they knew were being sold on the street. Well, you know, and this was from 2005 to 2009. Well, everybody knew that methadone, heroin, and oxycodone were being sold on the street. Down here is amitriptyline. That was added as a control. No one sells amitriptyline on the street. And this is buprenorphine. In 2005, the golden age of buprenorphine, in my mind, no one knew of it as a drug of abuse. But as time went on, up until 2009, we had more and more abuse and diversion of buprenorphine. Now in the United States, buprenorphine diversion is not something that occurs to get high, because heroin is so cheap and so plentiful in the United States that you don't need to use buprenorphine to try to get high. In addition, we use Suboxone, which makes buprenorphine much less appealing if you inject it. So what we use diverted buprenorphine for in the United States is to treat withdrawal. If you're a heroin addict down to your last $10, you can buy another bag of heroin and be sick in 6 hours, or you can buy a single 8 milligram buprenorphine tablet. And if you cut that tablet into pieces, you can take care of your withdrawal symptoms for a number of days. And so that's the main reason why buprenorphine is diverted and abused in the United States, but it's still a problem. And I'm really not so much worried about the people who buy the buprenorphine tablets as I am the people who sell buprenorphine tablets so they can go out and use heroin, which is significantly more dangerous. So we have opiate users. They're not adherent to their buprenorphine. They're diverting their buprenorphine. What do you do about that? Well, common sense tells you that you take buprenorphine and you put it into an implantable or injectable long-acting form that will prevent diversion and poor adherence. And we have those products right now. Probuphine, which is an implantable form of buprenorphine, was approved for use in the United States a couple years ago, and it's currently pending approval here in the European Union. We have Blockade, which is an injectable, once-a-month injectable form of buprenorphine that was approved for use in the United States and nowhere else yet. And then CAM 2038. This is a weekly or monthly injectable buprenorphine product that is pending approval in the United States as well as the European Union. All right, so let's talk about probuphine. Probuphine is a medication that borrows old technology and puts it to a new use. The Contraceptive Norplant, which you implanted in your arms, same kind of technology. You use ethinyl vinyl acetate polymer and you add your active medication to it. In the case of probuphine, it's buprenorphine. And what comes out are rods. You insert the rods in the upper arm and you can get 6 months of steady buprenorphine release. 4 rods will give you blood levels of buprenorphine equivalent to about 8 milligrams of daily sublingual buprenorphine. The rods are fairly easy to implant. I can do that as a psychiatrist. They're a little more tricky pulling them out, but the company will do a 1-day training and has trained clinicians in all fields of medicine, including a number of psychiatrists, to be able to do this, and it is not extremely difficult. It is possible. So that's probuphine. All right, so probuphine has been in testing for many, many years. The first trial, probuphine trial number 1, the first phase 3 trial, was published in JAMA in 2010. And that was 163 actively using heroin or prescription opiate-dependent patients. They were stabilized for a week or 2 on sublingual buprenorphine, 12 to 16 milligrams a day, and then they were switched to implants, either active or placebo, and they were treated with the implants for 6 months. Counseling was included, twice a week for the first 12 weeks, and once a week for the second 12 weeks. And urines were collected 3 times weekly over the entire 6 months of the trial. Now, in this trial, rescue doses of sublingual buprenorphine were allowed, and that actually turned out to be a little bit problematic for the approval of probuphine. The rescue doses were intended to treat breakthrough withdrawal symptoms or breakthrough craving. And you could receive a rescue dose if you had craving, if you had withdrawal, or if the investigator decided you ought to have one. You were limited to how many you could get. You could get rescue doses 3 days a week for 2 weeks in a row, or for 8 days in a 4-week period, and then you had to get an extra rod implanted. And if you needed more rescue doses after that, you got excluded from the trial. So we started with 4, and then there was an option of adding another. The outcome of this trial was very straightforward. They looked at the percentage of urine samples that were negative for opiates, either at the first 12 weeks or over the whole 24 weeks of the trial. This data shows the percent negative urines over the whole 24 weeks of the trial, with the probuphine patients achieving about 36% negative urines and the placebo patients achieving about 22%. So probuphine was effective in reducing opioid use compared to placebo in this phase 1 trial. The next trial they did, they compared probuphine to active probuphine to placebo probuphine, as well as open label sublingual buprenorphine in the form of Suboxone. 12 to 16 milligrams a day, open label buprenorphine, 119 patients. 4 placebo implants for 54 patients, and 114 patients received 4 buprenorphine implants. Subjects who achieved that target dose of 12 to 16 milligrams a day of buprenorphine naloxone for 3 consecutive days were eligible to be randomized. They were again treated for 6 months. Rescue doses were given similarly to the first trial, except the investigators were no longer allowed to give them at their discretion. You had to prove that you had withdrawal symptoms or craving to get those rescue doses, so they cut down on the amount of rescue doses that were allowed. And the outcome of this trial is shown here, and this is a continuous distribution function of opioid negative urines. And I hate continuous distribution functions because I think they're hard to read. So what I like to do is look at the 50 percentile. So what you see here is that about 50% of patients on the buprenorphine implant group And also, sublingual buprenorphine had 20% or fewer of their 72 urines positive for opiates. That means 50% were more successful. But 80% of those in the placebo group had 20% or fewer negative urines. That means 80% did worse than that. So no difference between the sublingual buprenorphine and Probufene. They were equivalent, significantly better than the placebo rods. So what happened? They went to the FDA, and the FDA did not approve Probufene based on the results of Trial 1 and Trial 2. Issues that came up, rescue doses was a problem. The low buprenorphine levels that were available through the rods. You could only get blood levels equivalent to 8 milligrams a day of buprenorphine. That was problematic, and actually very few patients in either trial achieved complete abstinence. So the company decided to request a different indication for Probufene and decided to look for an indication for the maintenance of abstinence in patients who were stable on low doses of buprenorphine. And they designed the third trial to test for that. And so what they did was they invited patients who were stable on 8 milligrams or less. They were on buprenorphine for 6 months. They were on 8 milligrams or less for 90 days prior to the trial, and they were abstinent for 90 days prior to the trial. And it was a double-blind, double-dummy comparison. Some patients had active rods and placebo sublingual. Some had active sublingual placebo rods. And the test was non-inferiority to a responder. And a responder was to be negative during 4 of the 6 months during the trial. And in fact, Probufene was non-inferior to sublingual buprenorphine in that outcome. In addition, Probufene was superior to sublingual buprenorphine in maintaining complete abstinence over the 6 months of the trial, as well as prolonging the time to first use of opiates during that trial. So based on this data, Probufene received FDA approval for this indication. Now what's happening currently is that the drug company Titan, who is sponsoring Probufene, is going to the European Union trying to find approval for Probufene. But in this case, they're asking for an extended indication that includes a broader range of patients and to be used at the initiation of treatment rather than a continuation of abstinence. And so that is expected to occur within the next year or so. So that's Probufene. But what if you're an opiate-dependent patient that needs an injectable or implantable, and you need it at the initiation of treatment, or you need it at a dose higher than 8 milligrams a day? What are your options? Your options are, one of your options is KAM-2038. And KAM-2038 is an injectable buprenorphine medication that uses a unique depot mechanism, the fluid crystal delivery technique. This is a liquid, lipid-based liquid that comes in a regular syringe with a small needle that can be injected subcutaneously. Dissolved within this lipid is the active medication, buprenorphine. When you inject it, fluids in the tissue cause the liquid to turn to a gel, which encapsulates the medication, and as the gel degrades, a steady dose of buprenorphine gets released. And you can do this with medications that can be released over weeks, days, or months, depends on how you make up the solution. So that's how KAM works. And what we know about KAM-2038 is that it provides blood levels of buprenorphine equivalent to what you can achieve with pretty high doses of sublingual buprenorphine, up to 24 milligrams a day. What's shown on this slide is population PK analysis and modeling based on the data from 4 clinical trials. What is shown on the panel on the left is a comparison of KAM-2038 at 32 milligrams a day, which is roughly equivalent to 24 milligrams of sublingual buprenorphine. And what's shown there is the median plasma buprenorphine concentration, 95% confidence intervals for both the sublingual and as well as the KAM. And you can see that the KAM gives you comparable blood levels to sublingual buprenorphine at a dose of 24 milligrams a day. On the right, you'll see just a comparison of the weekly KAM-2038 versus a monthly dose. The monthly dose is simply 4 times the weekly dose of the KAM-2038, but it's done at a higher concentration so that you only inject about a half a cc. It's a very comfortable injection. It can be given anywhere that you give insulin injections, and it's very well tolerated. So it gives you nice blood levels. What do we know about its efficacy? Well, we know that CAM2038 will suppress opiate withdrawal symptoms and block opiate effects. In a study that involved 47 opiate-dependent patients, moderate to severe, in good health, not treatment-seeking, they brought them in the hospital, they stabilized them on morphine, 30 milligrams 4 times a day, and they did challenge testing with hydromorphone, either 0, 6, or 18 milligrams, and they've got an injection on no medications, as well as injections after 2 injections of weekly CAM2038. And here you see the qualification dose. Patients who got 6 milligrams of hydromorphone liked it. People who got 18 milligrams liked it more. Placebo patients didn't, when they received placebo, they didn't like it very much. You give them an injection of CAM, and suddenly drug liking goes down to 0. This blue box represents what is the pre-specified complete blocking criteria. So it only went up drug liking on 10 millimeters on the visual analog scale. So you've got a nice prolonged blockade of subjective effects of hydromorphone. So it blocks the effects of opiates. Patients came in order to get their CAM injection, they had to show some signs of withdrawal, otherwise we'd precipitate withdrawal with it. They had COWS scores of about 9, gave them a CAM injection, and suddenly you get significantly decreased and stable lack of opiate withdrawal symptoms. So it's very good at taking away opiate withdrawal, very good at blocking subjective effects of opiates. So the next step was the phase 3 clinical trial, and this is the design of the trial. Patients were screened for 3 weeks, then randomized into a double-blind, double-dummy trial comparing sublingual buprenorphine to CAM2038. So some got sublingual buprenorphine and placebo CAM, some got placebo, CAM, and sublingual buprenorphine. And for 12 weeks, they got weekly CAM shots. For the second 12 weeks, they got monthly shots, and then follow up after that. So these are subjects, all moderate to severe patients with opioid use disorder. And so getting started on CAM was different. They weren't stabilized on sublingual buprenorphine. They received one single test dose of 4 milligrams of sublingual buprenorphine to make sure that they didn't go into precipitated withdrawal. Then they were randomized to 16 milligrams of subcutaneous buprenorphine, the CAM2038, or they received an additional 4 milligrams of sublingual buprenorphine. So on day 1, 8 milligrams of sublingual buprenorphine or 16 milligrams of the subcutaneous injection. On day 2, the sublingual guys got another 8 milligrams, so they're up to 16 milligrams. On day 4, the subcutaneous bup group received an additional 8 milligrams, so they're up to 24. And so the target was to get them between 16 and 24 milligrams of sublingual buprenorphine or around 24 milligrams of subcutaneous buprenorphine. And there you can see the dose equivalence. 16 of CAM is worth about 8 sublingual, and it goes up to 24 to 16, 32 to 24, and then there's the monthly dose equivalences. So on day 5 to 7, titrated up, and after week 1, the dosing was flexible, the idea being to make it look like clinical practice.
Kyle, 5 minutes.
5 minutes. Okay, we'll do this. CAM2038 in the study met the primary and secondary endpoints of non-inferiority to sublingual buprenorphine. For the European Medicine Agency, the outcome was simple. It was the percent urines that were negative over the course of the trial. For the FDA, it was a percent responders. To be a responder, you had to have abstinence at specific points during the trial. I would have gone into that, but for the interest of time, we're not going to go into that. But I will tell you that CAM2038 was found to be non-inferior to sublingual buprenorphine, and it was found to be superior to sublingual buprenorphine in one of the secondary outcomes, which was the continuous distribution function of the percent illicit opiate-free assessments. I prefer to look at this. This is the percent of the mean number of negative urines at different time points during the trial. The CAM group here, sublingual buprenorphine there. These denote the times when the difference was significant. This is missing imputed as positive. This is not imputed at all. So again, more opiate negative urines associated with CAM 2038 during this phase 3 trial. Was effective at reducing opiate withdrawal. This is the COWS score, sublingual buprenorphine and CAM, no difference, was able to reduce craving very effectively. So CAM 2038, effective medication, able to reduce withdrawal symptoms as well as craving. All right. Very quickly, I'll go on to Blockade. This was a medication developed by Indivior, which is a spin-off of Reckitt-Benckiser. It is a once-a-month injectable buprenorphine. It uses the Atrogel system, similar to the lipid crystal technology of CAM, but again, a different technology. The idea is that this is a polymer that comes in a liquid form, in a syringe, injectable with a small needle. When it hits the tissue, the liquid in the tissue causes the polymer to precipitate, trapping the medication. As the polymer degrades, the buprenorphine is released. It comes in a pre-filled syringe with a 300 milligram dose or a 100 milligram dose. Blockade, like CAM 2038, was very effective at blocking the subjective effects of opiates, specifically hydromorphone. In a very similar study to what was done with CAM, patients were exposed to hydromorphone challenges who were opiate dependent before and after receiving 2 injections of 300 milligrams of the Blockade. And after the Blockade injection, drug liking went down to less than 10. Any drug effect, again, went down to less than 20. Very effective at blocking subjective effects of hydromorphone. So that led next to the phase 3 trial. Patients were inducted onto buprenorphine, stabilized for 11 days, 8 to 24 milligrams, and then randomized to 3 conditions. Blockade, known as RBP 6000 here in this trial, 300 milligrams for 2 months, and then 100 milligrams for 4 months. That's the high dose, or the low dose rather, or RBP 6000, 300 milligrams every month for 6 months, or placebo injection, followed up at the end of 6 months. The 2 outcomes, the primary outcome was the continuous distribution function of the percent urine samples negative for opiates, supported by opiate self-report of illicit opiate use. And again, the 2 active groups versus a placebo group, you go to the median, and placebo had about 10% opiate-free weeks versus about 35% opiate-free weeks for the 2 active forms. If you look at a key secondary outcome, which was 80% of urine samples negative for opiates and negative self-report, the 2 active groups about 28% and placebo group about 2%. So again, this medication is efficacious for the treatment of opioid use disorder based on this trial, approved in the United States, but nowhere else. Blockade also suppresses opiate withdrawal symptoms and craving. Again, this is COWS, Clinical Opiate Withdrawal Scale, the 2 active groups down here, placebo group up there. And if you look at opiate craving on a visual analog scale, you get a significant reduction in both groups. So, to wrap this up quickly, most abusers are still using prescription opioids. That's still our main problem, but the crossover to heroin is becoming much more common, much more problematic. Fentanyl complicates this already severe problem with its increased potency and the exposure of fentanyl to people who have no idea that they're receiving it. We know that buprenorphine is an effective medication for the treatment of opiate use disorder, but the problems with buprenorphine include poor adherence and diversion. And we have now injectable, implantable buprenorphine that offer a significant advantage in completely preventing diversion and significantly reducing poor adherence. And we have medications currently approved, others that will be approved very, very soon. And with that, I will